Welcome to this week's lecture. This week we're going to be talking about cardiorespiratory fitness, another dimension within fitness that you may be setting goals for and working to train within. Cardiorespiratory fitness is absolutely a very important component of any exercise program, so it is something that you should be working towards. Before we get started on thinking about how you might implement a training program to improve your own cardiovascular fitness, let's understand the four different types of energy. The first one you see on your screen there is glucose. Glucose is a simple sugar. It's the most common form of energy used by the body, and we can find it in most tissues as well as the blood. Turns out it's one of the first fuels used to make energy when we start doing exercise. Glycogen is essentially individual glucose molecules all strung together. So it's those individual sugar molecules called glucose, but now they're in a long chain. We find this glucose stored together as glycogen, found within the liver, we find it in muscle cells, and we find some in the kidneys as well. And again, it's really just this storage form of glucose so that when the individual tissues start to run out of glucose, then glycogen will break down and release more and more of this sugar, more and more of this glucose into the blood. Next one you see on your screen there is fat. Fat's found primarily in adipose tissues, but it's also found in muscle tissue. It's also found within muscle cells. And it's used for long-term energy. It's also used for protection and for insulation around the body. So when you've been active for a long time, fat starts to become used more dominantly. And interestingly, per weight, fat can actually produce more energy than the individual sugars can. The last one you see there on your screen is protein. Protein's found in muscles. It's found essentially in almost all tissues throughout the body. Protein's made of individual building blocks that we call amino acids. You can think of them as little Lego blocks that get put together to build full proteins. These amino acids are then used for repairing or rebuilding tissues throughout the body. In a starvation state, we can actually use some of these amino acids for energy as well. But it's by no means the body's preferred source of energy. It's really a last resort. As we look at energy production, so we've talked about the four different kinds of energy. Now, how do we produce, what are the different types of energy production? There's two categories that we're going to deal with here. The first is anaerobic. And aerobic, that word you probably recognize from past, you've probably used it in the past even. When we look at it from a definition standpoint, aerobic means that it's going to be utilizing oxygen. So the first term that you see there, anaerobic, the an, the prefix just means not or without. So anaerobic means without oxygen, and you can see that identified there in the slide. Anaerobic types of energy production are going to be really short, really quick movements. When we think about short sprints, when we think about really high intensity weightlifting and those types of things, we're going to be producing the energy to do that motion through anaerobic means. Now, anaerobic means are typically going to use glucose and glycogen as the fuel sources to be able to create that energy production. The other side of the spectrum, or the other of the two terms that you see there, is aerobic. We already covered what that means. If anaerobic meant without oxygen, then aerobic means with oxygen. So these are going to be, this is going to be the type of energy, or this is going to be the format that we produce energy in when we're doing longer, slower types of movements. Whether it's distance running, whether it's downhill skiing, whether it's rollerblading, whether it's cycling, those are going to be more dominantly fueled through aerobic metabolism. So low intensity, but much higher volume. With aerobic metabolism, we're going to be utilizing glucose first, but then as the activity continues on, we're going to be utilizing fats at a higher and higher rate. If you're working on building your muscular endurance, then you can see sort of that same concept of low intensity and high volume. It means the further you go into that activity, the longer the duration of the activity, the more likely you are to be burning a higher percentage of fats. As we look at the energy systems now, the first one's going to be the phosphagen energy system. So this includes a couple of different kinds of molecules that are stored right within the muscle cells themselves. Creatine phosphate and adenosine triphosphate are the two molecules. You can hear phosphate in both of those, and that's how they are referred to as the phosphagen energy system. It's really a borrowing system. It's borrowing elements, or it's borrowing connections that are already present within the cell. So that ATP or creatine phosphate, those are depleted really, really quickly. You can see there from the slide that if we're doing max activity, you're only going to get about 5 to 7 seconds of energy out of this particular system. And it can take between 5 and 10 minutes to fully refill. The next system that you see, the next system that's typically recruited by the body when we're talking about high intensity activity, would be the anaerobic energy system. And you can see that it's going to be able to provide energy for anywhere in this range from 10 seconds all the way up to 2 minutes. So this system, like we said before, is primarily going to be utilizing glucose, or we talked about in the last slide that glycogen will be broken down and release that individual glucose molecules that then go into the blood. So the anaerobic system is primarily utilizing glucose. Anaerobic activities you can think of as typically being within that muscle strength spectrum that we talked about last week. The higher intensity, lower volume kinds of things, that's more like what we're going to be thinking of as an anaerobic type activity. The aerobic energy system, now this is a system that's going to be able to produce energy for a really long time. Anything over about 2 minutes means that you're going to be moving into utilizing the aerobic energy system more than the other two. It initially, the aerobic system that is, initially utilizes glucose for energy, but like we talked about in the last slide, the longer that activity goes on, the more likely you are to be utilizing fats for the fuel source to be able to run through this energy system. Now, this is definitely a sliding scale. So as we sort of identify these ranges when the phosphagen system, the anaerobic system, and the aerobic system are all working, they're all modified based off of the duration of an activity and the intensity of an activity. So these give you a good framework for understanding the energy systems, but there is definitely a lot more complexity that could be explored in each of them. Let's look at a slightly different area, but also very important in understanding how to do our programming within cardiovascular endurance. So, first off, we're going to look at heart rate. This just represents how many times your heart beats in 1 minute. And when we look at cardiovascular programming, trying to decide how hard, what intensity, and what duration we should be doing activities at, we're going to be utilizing this maximum heart rate as a reference value. Just like when we looked at muscle strength, we looked at the 1 repetition max as a reference value. Now, how do we find our max heart rate, though, for this cardiovascular work? Well, when we look at a max heart rate, we have a very simple equation to be able to identify what a safe maximal heart rate is. And that is just taking the static value of 220, that number never changes, 220 minus whatever your age is. So, for a 20-year-old individual, this is simple math. That 220 minus the age of a 20-year-old leaves their maximum heart rate at about 200. So that represents the upper limits of what they should be working at safely across any duration of time. So we can use these values to help plan out the intensity of our own cardiovascular workouts. A really low intensity workout, if we're really interested if we're really interested in a low intensity, long duration type workout, and that's what we want to plan for, we might set our workout to be around 50% of our maximum heart rate. So if we take that 20-year-old whose maximum heart rate was 200, 50% of that would be about 100 beats per minute. So we can have this reference point then for if I want a longer duration but lower intensity workout, this 50%, I can have something that I can use my smart or digital device to be able to track. Am I working within that range? Am I staying at about that intensity? Two other concepts that are helpful to understand around cardiovascular endurance: stroke volume and cardiac output. Stroke volume just represents how much blood your heart pumps out with every individual beat, and we measure it in milliliters. So it's not measured really. When we look at stroke volume, this is not something that you're going to be measuring yourself. This is something that's only going to be measured or quantified in a clinical setting. So we'll typically, your exercise physiologist might look at what is cardiac output, or what is the stroke volume, how much blood is the heart ejecting in milliliters, and utilize along with that what is the heart rate of the individual, how quickly is their heart beating. And the two of those combined, you can see, represent what a person's cardiac output is. It also gives us a really clear, really quantifiable, really discriminatory, easy way to identify what a person's intensity level is for a given activity. So that cardiac output we've already hit on a little bit. It represents what is the stroke volume, utilizing that value multiplied by what their heart rate is, or how many beats per minute their heart is beating at. And it gives us an amazingly accurate indication of what a workload is for each person at a given activity. It also super modifiable. Like at rest, your cardiac output is probably around 4 milliliters per minute. But in higher levels of exercise intensity, we can say that climb as much as 5 times to somewhere near the 20 milliliters per minute of cardiac output. So let's move on though. Let's talk a little bit about cardiorespiratory training. So when we continue to think about why would we want to be doing cardiovascular or cardiorespiratory training, we can see that one of the great benefits, one of the most known benefits, is its impact, like we saw with muscular strength and endurance, to be able to help with disease prevention. So we know that cardiovascular endurance has the ability to reduce the risk of diabetes, to reduce the risks of heart disease, and of blood pressure, all things that you also saw with muscular strength and endurance training. So making sure that you develop patterns of being active and consistently active now and throughout your lifespan is really important to us, and we hope it becomes important to you. Other benefits of cardiovascular training: improved cellular metabolism. So this is going to mean that the individual cells, that's what cellular is going to refer to, the individual cells, they're going to elevate their metabolism, and they're going to lower the need for resting heart rate. So by elevating metabolism, it means that they are going to naturally use more energy at rest. Their metabolism is higher. They're going to naturally use more energy at rest to function correctly, to function naturally. But they're not going to be putting a constant or consistent strain on the heart. That's what that lowering heart rate represents. So if we have an elevated heart rate across our lifespan, that means our heart is beating more and more across minutes, across hours, across days. A person with a higher heart rate, their heart is just working consistently more than a person with a lower heart rate. So it's one of the great benefits that cardiovascular training brings to us. It's just the capacity for our own heart to not suffer some of the strains that then lead on to further forms of disease. You can see in the slide, the last point there is that we can also see an improvement in body composition with cardiorespiratory training. So the greater use of glucose and fat as our body becomes more adept at recruiting and utilizing these individual fuels, and our own cellular metabolism has elevated, then that means that fat is going to be less likely to be stored in adipose tissue when we look at long durations of time. So this isn't a 1 week or a 2 week sort of fix, but as you continue to incorporate cardiovascular activities into your lifestyle habits, then you also are much more likely to see a greater benefit in your own body composition. From cardiorespiratory training, we also see a great benefit within our own bone health. This is something we also saw last week within the muscular strength and endurance lecture. Cardiovascular or cardiorespiratory training is going to increase our bone mass and our bone density. It prevents deterioration, and just like we talked about last week, that's going to lead to fewer fractures. That's going to lead to less injuries, obviously, but also longer. It's going to leave you independent and mobile for much longer and feel like you're much more able to be engaged in whatever the activities that you love are for much longer periods of time. We're also going to see an improvement of the immune function with cardiorespiratory training, and we see psychological implications. So it has being active, just being active, especially doing cyclical motions like cardiorespiratory endurance really requires, has an impact on your mental health. It will help to improve your sleep, which is one of the key areas that we're going to talk about later in the semester. It'll help to decrease anxiety, and it'll help to increase confidence. And it has further impacts on your mental health beyond just those areas as well. So let's look at how are we going to start making decisions about our own programming. Well, here's a general recommendations using that FIT principle that we were introduced to last week. But now you see that FIT principle applied to cardiorespiratory training as opposed to when we looked at it applied to muscular strength and muscular endurance. So the F for frequency, how often should we be engaged in cardiorespiratory training? Well, now we see 3 to 5 days per week, many days out of the week. And the distinction between this range of between 3 and 5 days is going to be related back down to that intensity level. So if we are doing a lower intensity training, then we're going to be wanting to do that more frequently. If we're doing a higher intensity kind of training, then as you can guess, we're going to be seeing a lower frequency. That we're going to be looking at more like 3 days per week if we're doing high intervals or high intensity intervals. We're going to be looking more like 5 days a week if we're looking at lower intensity, longer duration sort of cardiovascular exercises. So we've hit on the intensity there a little bit already. The ranges that we're going to be looking to utilize in our own decision making for programming is going to be somewhere between 60 probably and 95% of your max heart rate. Remember, your maximum heart rate was calculated by taking the static number of 220 and subtracting your age. Time or the duration, how long are these activities going to be going on? We're looking at activities lasting between 20 and 60 minutes. And again, those are really dependent. The distinction that you make, the decision that you make about how long you should be engaged in this is based on that intensity level again. And then what are the types? Again, these are really cyclical type motions, meaning that you repeat the same kind of movement over and over and over again using large muscle groups. So the most common example that probably jumped into your mind already was running, but cycling, swimming, using the rowing machine, using ellipticals, those are all good examples as well. So let's look at a couple examples. So we've written up 2 different examples, and even within the 2 examples that I've written up, I put in a couple of variations so that you can start to see how this might be applied into a program that you might develop for yourself. The first program that I have written up here is utilizing high intensity intervals. So utilizing these high intensity intervals. The second one is going to be using long duration, low intensity type activities. So let's start out. We want to start every workout with a warm-up, Here I have written in between 5 and 10 minutes of some light activity, whether it's jogging or elliptical or whatever it may be. I have this individual engaged within some stability work, so they may be going through a warm-up. They may just have a series of drills that we have set up for their warm-up. But let's look mostly at their workout for right now. You can see on this slide that I actually have two different variations set up based off of their intensity for these high intensity intervals. The first one, doing 10 sets of 15 seconds, so they're only running for 15 seconds, or they're only being active for 15 seconds, but they're doing it at 85 to 90% of their max heart rate. This means this is nearly your fastest sprint. This is definitely in sprint territory, and this is nearly as fast as you can run. You're doing it for 15 seconds, and then you're taking a break. So when we look at these intervals, interval represents a time of a work phase with an intentional and planned rest phase, then another work phase, then another intentional planned rest phase. And you just keep cycling through that interval. So we know that they're going to be doing 15 seconds of this sprint. The rest phase, or the rest or walking phase, is going to be between 30 seconds and 1 minute. Then as soon as that 30-second or as that rest phase is done, they're back into another 15-second sprint for a total of 10 of those individual sprints. Now, the rest phase is there to try and recover back nearly, not necessarily to full, but to nearly full capacity so that you can get back to the same level of exertion as that first sprint, or as close as you possibly can. But what's another option? What's another way that we could structure some high intensity intervals? Well, if we look at the slide, the second one that we had, the second example we have there, is now they're doing 6 times 30-second runs. You notice that the intensity has dropped from that very high intensity of all the way up to 90%, now in a range of between 75 and 85%. Now this is still a real fast run, but it's not the same level of sprint that they were doing before. Because the intensity is lower, we're able to drag out or extend the duration of the interval. So they'll be doing 30 seconds at this level of intensity. Then they're going to be having a rest or walking phase that now is between 1 and 2 minutes between their rests. So the rest phase should really be mostly dependent on how long is the work phase of the interval. In the first example, you saw them sprinting for 15 seconds. Then we gave them a rest phase of between 30 seconds and 1 minute. We doubled the amount of time that they needed to be in their run. Although we did decrease the intensity, we doubled the amount of time they needed to be in their run for the second example. And now you also see that the rest phase for that has been extended as well. Then as they finish whichever workout plan that they were following, we get to our cool down, which we're going to make sure we never forget. Here we see them walking or jogging for 5 to 10 minutes, working on some flexibility, whether that be dynamic or static stretching again. So that was high intensity intervals. Let's take a look at another example. What if we want to do a longer duration, lower intensity type of cardiovascular workout? Well, let's look at this. In this particular plan, what I've hypothetically written up, we have our warm-up, which we're never going to skip. In this particular portion, they're going to be doing a 5 to 10 minutes of a light activity. That again could be jogging or elliptical or whatever is appropriate or available for that warm-up time frame. I then have them moving into some stability work, and I have them running through a warm-up drill series again. Then let's look at the workout, which is the distinction, the difference between the first slide that we looked at and now this slide that we're looking at. Now you can see that this particular person is scheduled for between 30 and 60 minutes, not seconds, but between 30 and 60 minutes of activity. But because of that very long duration, we're going to bring the intensity down as well. So now they're looking at that 50 to 60% of their maximum heart rate. How do we quantify what that is? Again, you can be utilizing your smart devices. We could also be checking our own heart rate in physiologically. But that 50%, if we're a 20-year-old, we went through the calculation, that would be wanting to keep our heart rate somewhere around 100 beats per minute to 120 beats per minute across that entire 30 to 60 minutes of activity. But you'll see I also put in another example here. So here's a second example of a longer duration activity. In the second example, they're going to be doing 30 minutes of activity, but they're going to be increasing the intensity of that activity in these 5-minute jumps. We call this a tempo run. So they may be starting at that 50% of their max heart rate. So that once they've gone through their warm-up, they go out for their run. They're working at and checking to see that the intensity, utilizing a smart device or a heart rate monitor or whatever they're utilizing to capture this, that they're working at about 100 beats per minute. Then after 5 minutes of work at that workload, they would jump it up another 5%. So they move from 50 to 55% of their max heart rate. After another 5 minutes, you jump up again till you get up to 60, and you continue to jump up till you get to somewhere between 65 or 70% of your max heart rate. Then whatever the duration is that's left, whatever amount of time within that 30 minutes is still remaining, you're going to continue to work out at that either 65% or 70%, whichever this athlete or this participant chose. So following that, then we make sure we don't skip our cool down. We have in here they're doing some nice strides, elongating out those hamstrings, 2 by 60 meters of nice and easy, not high intensity, just striding out for 2 60-meter stretches. Then for flexibility, I have written in for them that they're going to be doing some dynamic or some static stretching again. So I've shown you a couple of variations in both the interval form of cardiovascular training and the sort of longer activity version of cardiovascular training. I think that we're really blessed that we have the opportunity to find multiple different formats or multiple different training programs for cardiovascular endurance. You can look for plans off of the internet. You can utilize YouTube. If you know what your goals are, you can find a variety of different workouts that keep moving you towards your goal, but don't make you feel static, like you have to repeat the same workout over and over and over again. So I think this is a great way to continue your motivation, but also be able to continue you on towards your goals. Thanks for being here. I look forward to seeing you next week.